On the morning of 14 September 1967, two things happened in the life of Watkins Electric Music. One would be celebrated in the music press for decades. The other, almost no one outside a small office in Charing Cross Road would know about for years. In a rehearsal hall in West London, a young guitarist plugged his lead into a WEM Dominator combo, struck a single open chord, and felt the room shake. The amplifier was British-built, hand-wired, and loud in a way that American imports of the same wattage simply were not. The technician who had carried it in that morning watched the guitarist grin, nod, and say the words that every British amp builder in the late 60s wanted to hear. He'd take two. That same morning, 4 miles away, in a narrow upstairs office above a music shop, Charlie Watkins sat at a desk piled with letters, invoices, and a thin gray ledger. He was 45 years old, the son of a London cab driver, and the man who had almost single-handedly built the British PA system industry from nothing. He had just finished reading a letter from his bank. He folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer beneath his desk, and did not mention it to his brother, his engineers, or the men on the factory floor in Offley Road. The letter said, in the polite language of British high street banking, that the overdraft facility he had been quietly relying on for the better part of a year would not be extended again at the same terms. The guitarist in West London did not know this. The factory workers in South London did not know this. The dealers placing their autumn orders did not know this. For the next 2 decades, the public story of WEM and the private story of WEM would walk side by side, sometimes touching, sometimes drifting apart, but never quite the same story at all. This is what the gap between those two stories looked like, and this is what it cost. Part 2. The Public Surface. A British Sound is Born. To the outside world, in the autumn of 1967, Watkins Electric Music was one of the most exciting names in British music. The company's logo, those 4 sharp letters, WEM, was stenciled onto speaker cabinets in nearly every working club, ballroom, and youth hall in the country. If you played in a band in Britain in that decade, you almost certainly stood at some point in front of WEM gear. Charlie Watkins had not started out building amplifiers. He had started out in the years just after the war selling accordions. The shop on Charing Cross Road, opened with his brother Reg in 1949, had been a modest affair. Sheet music, second-hand instruments, the occasional saxophone. But Charlie had a restless mechanical mind. He listened to the young guitar players coming into the shop in the mid-50s, asking for something louder, something cleaner, something that could cut through a drum kit in a dance hall, and he began, in the back room, to build it. The Watkins Dominator, launched in 1957, was one of the first British-designed guitar amplifiers built specifically for the new electric guitar sound. Its angled V-fronted cabinet became instantly recognizable. Within 2 years, it was on stages across the country. By 1958, the Watkins Copycat, a tape echo unit that became for a generation of British guitarists the sound of rock and roll itself, was in production. Hank Marvin used one. Joe Meek built records around them. The Copycat, in its various forms, would remain in production for over 40 years. By the early 60s, Charlie Watkins had done something remarkable. He had taken a company that began with accordions and turned it into a manufacturer whose equipment defined the sonic character of British popular music. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that made WEM not just a brand but a national institution, came in 1965 at the Richmond Jazz and Blues Festival. Part 3. The Hidden Reality. A company too small for its own success. While the public was hearing the Watkins name on radios and stages, the men who worked at Watkins Electric Music were living a different reality. The factory was not, in any modern sense, a factory. It was a series of rooms above and behind the Charing Cross Road shop, and later a small industrial unit in Offley Road, Kennington. The workforce, at its largest, never exceeded a few dozen people. Cabinets were built by hand, speakers were wired by hand, chassis were point-to-point soldered by men who had learned their trade in the wartime electronics industry and who, in many cases, were now in their 50s and 60s. Charlie Watkins ran the company in the same way his father had run a London cab, by instinct, by personal relationships, by handshake agreements. There was no real marketing department. There was no proper costing system. Prices were set, in many cases, by what Charlie thought a working musician could afford, not by what the units cost to build. The orders by 1965 were arriving faster than WEM could fulfill them. Letters from dealers in Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, and Belfast piled up on Charlie's desk, asking when the next batch of Dominators would ship, when the next consignment of copycats would arrive. The answer was almost always soon. Soon was a word that did a lot of work in the Watkins office. Behind that word was a quiet, mounting problem. WEM was building products that the country wanted faster than WEM could build them, and every unfulfilled order, every late shipment was being financed by short-term credit from a bank that, in the polite language of British high street banking, was beginning to ask questions. Part 4. The Public Surface, Windsor, 1967, and the Sound of a New Era. In the summer of 1967, the National Jazz and Blues Festival moved to Windsor. The headline acts included Cream, Jeff Beck, Donovan, and a then rising band called Pink Floyd. The festival drew a crowd estimated to be over 30,000 people. The PA system that carried the music to those 30,000 people was built by Watkins Electric Music. This was not an incidental detail. In 1967, the idea of a PA system that could cover an open field with intelligible sound was, in Britain, almost entirely new. American festivals had begun to experiment with it. British festivals had not. Charlie Watkins, working with a small team of engineers, designed and built a multi-cabinet PA stack, 1,000 watts of clean amplification divided across columns, distributed across the field, that did something British live music had never done before. It made the band audible to everyone. The musicians who played that summer remembered it. The promoters remembered it. The trade press remembered it. Within months, WEM PA hire was being booked for festivals, for tours, for civic events. By 1969, the company was supplying PA systems for the Isle of Wight Festival. By 1970, for the Glastonbury Fair. The 4 letters on the speaker cabinets had become, for a generation, the sound of British outdoor music. To the public, this was the peak, the triumph, the moment the small London firm became a national institution. Part 5. The Hidden Reality. The cost of being the sound of a generation. In Charlie Watkins's drawer, beneath the polite letter from the bank, a second letter had now arrived, and then a third. The PA hire business that the public saw as WEM's greatest triumph was, for the company, a financial weight that almost nothing in its existing structure was designed to carry. PA systems for festivals were enormous capital outlays. The cabinets had to be built, transported, installed, and maintained. Engineers had to be paid to travel and operate them. Insurance had to be carried. And, crucially, the festivals themselves often paid late, paid partially, or, in the chaotic British festival economy of the late 60s and early 70s, did not pay at all. Charlie Watkins, by his own later admission, did not always invoice properly. He did not always chase payment. He gave equipment to bands he liked. He lent gear to promoters he trusted. He He underpriced his services because he believed, with a kind of working-class pride that defined his entire career, that British musicians deserved British equipment at a price they could afford. This was, as a philosophy, magnificent. As a business model, it was a slow-burning fuse. By the early 1970s, the gap between the public WEM and the private WEM had grown into a chasm. On stages from Reading to Belfast, the WEM logo blazed under the lights. In the Offaly Road office, Charlie Watkins was increasingly signing personal guarantees to keep the company solvent. Meanwhile, 400 miles north, the world was changing in a way the small London firm was not yet ready to understand. Part 6. The Public Surface, the 70s, and the Arrival of the Giants. In the dance halls of the early 60s, a 100-watt amplifier was a serious piece of equipment. By 1972, it was barely enough for a pub gig. The arena rock era had arrived. Bands were playing to 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people. The PA systems required were no longer the 1,000-watt stacks Charlie Watkins had pioneered at Windsor. They were 10,000-watt, 20,000-watt, custom-built behemoths designed by specialist firms in California and increasingly by a new generation of British competitors. Marshall in Bletchley had become a global brand. Hiwatt, building in Surrey, had cornered the high-power professional market with brutally engineered amplifiers that British and American touring acts trusted absolutely. Across the Atlantic, JBL, Alltech, and a young firm called Cervin Vega were redefining what large-scale live sound meant. Watkins Electric music, in this new landscape, found itself in an awkward middle place. It was no longer the only British innovator. It was no longer the loudest. It was no longer the obvious choice for a major touring act. What it still was, and this is the cruelty of the story, was loved. Working musicians, club bands, school halls, youth groups, semi-professional acts across the length and breadth of Britain still bought WEM. The copycat was still in production. The Dominator was still being made in updated forms. The PA hire division still worked festivals. To the public, WEM in 1975 was still WEM. The logo was still on the cabinets. Charlie Watkins still answered the phone himself. Part 8. The Hidden Reality. The Quiet Retreat. Inside the company, a slow, painful contraction had begun. It was not announced. It was not reported in the music press. It was not discussed at trade fairs. It happened instead in the way British industrial decline so often happens, through 1,000 small decisions, each defensible on its own, each adding up to something none of the people making them had ever intended. The factory at Offaly Road reduced its workforce. Production lines that once ran 6 days a week now ran 4. New product development, the lifeblood of any electronics company, slowed to a trickle. The men who had been hand-wiring chassis for 15 years began to retire, and the apprentices who might have replaced them were not hired because the orders, while steady, were no longer growing. Charlie Watkins, by the late 1970s, was running a company that, in any rational accounting sense, should have either expanded aggressively or sold itself to a larger firm. He did neither. He held on. He held on because the company carried his name. He held on because the men on the factory floor were his friends. He held on because the alternative, selling to a larger company that would inevitably move production, change the brand, or close the factory, was to him unthinkable. And in the holding on, the company began, almost imperceptibly, to fall behind. Part 8. The Public Surface. The Early 1980s and the Last Great Years. The early 1980s brought to the outside world what looked like a second wind for WEM music. Punk and post-punk had created a new generation of bands who valued exactly what WEM had always offered, Affordable, reliable, distinctively British equipment built by people who understood working musicians. Indie bands across Britain plugged into copycats and dominators. The PA hire division continued to work the smaller festival circuit. New products, including a range of mixing desks and updated combo amplifiers, appeared in the catalogs. For a moment, in 1982 and 1983, it looked as if the company might find its place in the new decade. Trade press articles from this period speak of Charlie Watkins as a grand old man of the British music industry, a survivor, a pioneer, a craftsman whose products were still made in London by hand when so many of his competitors had moved production overseas. Music magazines ran features on the copycats' continued use by name acts. Vintage WEM PA columns began to acquire among collectors and engineers a kind of reverent status. The brand, in 1983, was still the brand. Part 9. The hidden reality, the numbers no one was talking about. But the brand was not the balance sheet, and the balance sheet, by 1983, told a story the public never read. The cost of manufacturing in London, rates, rent, wages, electricity, raw materials, had risen relentlessly throughout the late 70s and early 80s. The cost of imported components, particularly the specialist transistors and integrated circuits that modern amplifier design required, had risen with the pound's volatility. The price British dealers were willing to pay for WEM gear had not risen at the same rate. The margin, that thin layer of profit that had sustained the company for 30 years, was being squeezed from both ends. At the same time, a new competitor had appeared on the British market: Japanese-built equipment. Yamaha, Roland, Peavey from America, and a wave of lesser-known Asian brands began to flood the entry-level and mid-tier markets with amplifiers and PA gear that were, in many cases, cheaper than WEM and built to a perfectly acceptable standard. For the working musician on a tight budget, the very musician WEM had always served, the choice was no longer obvious. Charlie Watkins, by the mid-80s, was past 60. The fire that had built the company was still there. The body and the bank balance that had carried that fire were not. He began quietly to look for a buyer. He did not find one easily. The company that once defined British live sound was now, in the eyes of larger firms, a brand without a clear future. Part 10. The public surface, the slow fade. For viewers who lived through it, the disappearance of WEM is hard to date. There was no announcement. There was no front-page story. There was no closing down sale on Charing Cross Road, with photographers outside and weeping employees carrying boxes to the curb. There was instead a slow fade. Through the late 1980s, the products in the catalogs thinned. The PA hired division wound down. The copycat, that totem of British rock and roll, was eventually discontinued in its original form, though variants would resurface in later years under different ownership. The Awfully Road factory ceased its main production. Verify exact detail. Charlie Watkins, in his late 60s and then his 70s, continued to give interviews, attend trade events, and speak warmly about the British music industry that he had, more than almost any other single individual, helped to build. The brand did not die, it simply receded. By the early 90s, WEM existed largely as a name on second-hand equipment, traded between collectors and working musicians, prized for its sound, valued for its history. The factory was gone, the workforce was gone, the orders were gone. What remained was the gear itself. Thousands of cabinets, amplifiers, echo units, mixing desks, scattered across the country in lofts, garages, rehearsal rooms, and stages, still working, in many cases, decades after the company that built them had quietly stopped. Part 11. The hidden reality, what the bank statements said. In the company's final working years, the financial picture told a story the public version never quite captured. The accounts, where they survive, show a company that had been undercapitalized for most of its existence. They show a founder who had personally guaranteed credit lines that, in a larger firm, would have been routinely rolled over by a finance director. They show a manufacturer whose unit economics had been compressed year after year by inflation in costs and resistance in prices. They show a brand that, despite its fame, never commanded the premium pricing that its quality justified, because Charlie Watkins had never been willing to charge what his equipment was actually worth. There is a particular figure that captures the story. At its peak in the late 60s, Watkins Electric Music employed somewhere in the region of 40 to 60 people. Verify exact detail. By the late 80s, that figure had dwindled to a handful. The contraction was not violent, it was not dramatic. It was the contraction of a company that had been, for 2 decades, holding on. The bank letters, the polite ones, became less polite. The conversations with suppliers became more difficult. The conversations with the men on the factory floor, the men who had built the cabinets and wired the chassis and been there since the 60s, became, in Charlie Watkins' own later words, the hardest conversations he had ever had to have. Part 12. The Convergence, when the two stories became one. The two timelines of Watkins Electric Music, the one the public saw and the one Charlie Watkins lived, converged at last in a series of obituaries. When Charlie Watkins died in 1914 at the age of 90, verify exact detail, the British music press wrote about him with a warmth and seriousness that matched his importance to the country's musical history. He was described accurately as the father of the British PA system. He was described accurately as the inventor whose copycat had shaped the sound of a generation. He was described accurately as a man whose work had been heard by millions, but who had remained, in person, modest, generous, and unfailingly approachable. What the obituaries did not always describe, and what the gap between the public and private stories of WEM finally revealed, was the cost of that modesty. The cost of charging working musicians a fair price rather than a profitable one. The cost of refusing to move production overseas when his competitors did. The cost of keeping his factory in London when the economics no longer supported it. The cost of being, in the most British and most working-class sense of the word, decent. The convergence, when it came, was not a collapse. There was no Woolworth-style overnight closure, no Carillion-style scandal, no M.G. Rover-style political reckoning. There was instead the quiet completion of a long, slow story that had been running in 2 parallel tracks for nearly half a century. The man who had made the sound of British rock and roll possible had, in the end, made the company that bore his name a casualty of his own values.
Part 13. The Aftermath. What Britain Lost. To understand what was lost when WEM faded, you have to understand what WEM have been. It had not been simply an amplifier company. It had been a piece of British industrial culture of a particular and now nearly extinct kind. It had been a manufacturer that designed its own products, built its own products, sold its own products, and serviced its own products, all within a few miles of the Thames. It had been a firm whose engineers could be reached on the telephone. It had been a brand whose founder answered his own letters. When WEM faded, Britain lost, though it did not always notice, a model of how a small electronics manufacturer could serve a national industry. The Marshalls, the Hiwatts, the Vox of an earlier era had similar stories, and most of them, in their original forms, are gone too. The British amplifier industry, which had once been the envy of the world, contracted into a handful of brands, many of them now owned by larger international groups, most of them now manufactured, in whole or in part, outside the United Kingdom. The festivals that WEM had pioneered now used PA systems built in Germany, in the United States, in China. The recording studios that had once been wired with British-built outboard now used digital equipment manufactured overseas. The rehearsal rooms in Manchester and Glasgow and Cardiff, where a generation of bands had learned their trade on Watkins gear, now hosted a different generation on different equipment with no particular awareness of who had built the sound their predecessors had played through. And the men who had wired the chassis, built the cabinets, and shipped the orders out of Awfuley Road, the men who had been, in the truest sense, the people who made the music possible, were, by the time the brand had fully faded, retired, dispersed, or gone. Part 14. The Workers, the Town, the Silence. Awfuley Road in Kennington is still there. The building that housed the WEM factory is still there. If you walk along it on a quiet weekday afternoon, you will find no plaque, no marker, no indication that for several decades this was the place where some of the most distinctive sounds of British popular music were physically built. This, perhaps, is the most British thing about the story. In other countries, in other industrial cultures, the building would be marked. There would be a museum, or a tour, or at least a sign. The Watkins copycat would be in Japan a national design treasure with its own exhibition. In Germany, the Dominator amplifier would be on display in a museum of electronic instruments. In the United States, the WEM PA columns would be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In Britain, they are in lofts, in garages, in second-hand shops in suburban high streets. In the hands of working musicians who know what they have, but who rarely think about who made it, or where, or why that place no longer exists. The silence around the WEM story is not unique. It is the same silence that surrounds the closure of so many British industrial firms, large and small. It is the silence of a country that, somewhere in the late 19th century, stopped knowing how to grieve for the things it stopped making. Part 15. The Public and the Private, Finally Visible. What the gap between the two timelines of Watkins Electric music finally reveals when both stories are told together is something larger than the fate of one small London company. It reveals the way British industrial decline so often actually happened, not through dramatic collapse, but through the slow, dignified, almost invisible exhaustion of firms whose founders had built them on values their balance sheets could no longer sustain. It reveals the way British manufacturing culture, in its mid-century form, depended on a generation of self-taught engineers, working-class proprietors, and small-firm craftsmen whose successors were never trained because the firms that would have trained them had quietly stopped expanding. It reveals the way a brand can be loved and lost at the same time. The way the WEM logo on a cabinet at a festival in 1969 could mean the future of British live sound, and the same logo on a second-hand cabinet in a shop window in 1995 could mean nothing at all to the teenager walking past it. It reveals the way Charlie Watkins' deepest virtues, his loyalty to his workforce, his pricing for working musicians, his refusal to outsource, were in the end the very things that placed his company on the wrong side of the economic forces that reshaped British manufacturing in the late 19th century. And it reveals perhaps most uncomfortably the way the country that had been served so well by men like Charlie Watkins ultimately did very little to ensure that the firms they built would survive them. Part 16. The Closing Reflection, What the Gap Reveals. There is a phrase in British industrial memory that gets used too often and meant too rarely. The phrase is, "They don't make them like that anymore." In the case of Watkins Electric music, the phrase is literally true. They do not make the Watkins copycat in its original form anymore. They do not build the original Dominator combo on Awfuley Road anymore. They do not assemble multi-thousand-watt PA columns in a small London factory and ship them out to festivals across the country anymore.
The men who knew how to do these things have, in most cases, retired or passed away. The apprentices who would have learned from them were never hired. The workshops where the knowledge lived were closed, sold, or repurposed. The gear remains. The sound remains. The recordings made through that gear, on those amplifiers, with those echo units, will outlast every one of us. They are, in their way, the most durable monument WEM has. But the company that built them, the small London firm with the founder who answered his own phone, the engineers who hand-wired the chassis, the workforce that never grew large enough to dilute the brand, that company is gone. And the gap between the public story of its triumph and the private story of its slow exhaustion is the truest portrait we have of how a particular kind of British industry ended. It did not fail loudly. It did not fail spectacularly. It did not even, in the end, fail in any way that anyone outside its own walls fully noticed. It simply, after decades of holding on, let go. And the country it had served, the musicians it had equipped, the festivals it had made possible, the working-class craft tradition it had embodied, that country went on listening, on stages and in studios and in bedrooms, to records made through Watkins gear, without ever quite registering that the company which built it had quietly, decently, and almost invisibly disappeared. That is what the gap between the two stories of WEM reveals. That this is how Britain lost its rock and roll empire. Not in a single collapse, but in two parallel timelines, running side by side for half a century, until the public story finally caught up with the private one, and found, at the end, nothing but an empty building on Offley Road, a logo on a second-hand cabinet, and a silence where a small, stubborn, magnificent London factory used to be.